Module 4, Objective 9, review the aerobic and anaerobic mechanisms by which muscle fibers obtain the energy to power contractions and the byproducts of those metabolic activities. The only energy source used directly for muscle contraction is ATP, and recall ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is a modified nucleotide. Muscle contraction utilizes a lot of ATP, and the muscle can actually store ATP at the start of contraction, but it has to have mechanisms that will generate ATP in order to sustain muscular contractions. At rest, skeletal muscle fibers produce more ATP than they need, so they transfer some of that extra energy to a molecule of creatine. And in doing so, they create creatine phosphate. Basically, ATP is going to donate one of its high-energy phosphate groups to this molecule of creatine. And in doing so, they create this creatine phosphate. And they can then reclaim that phosphate group, add it to ADP, and recreate a molecule of ATP. So creatine phosphate is just a backup. It's a sort of like a backup generator. It's going to hold a little bit of extra energy that can then be used to recreate ATP molecules when needed. There is an enzyme that's required for this conversion in order for creatine phosphate to donate its phosphate group back to ADP. We need the enzyme creatine kinase, CK, and that's going to be available when the cell needs to generate more ATP from its backup source. Once creatine phosphate is used up, the cell needs other mechanisms in order to generate ATP. So, when we look at the generation of ATP by skeletal muscle fibers, we have the direct phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is just the adding of that high-energy phosphate group of ADP by creatine phosphate. The other two mechanisms that generate ATP include anaerobic and aerobic metabolism. Anaerobic metabolism, the word itself means that it does not require oxygen, so without oxygen, while aerobic metabolism requires oxygen, so it actually requires the presence of oxygen in order to do that. Anaerobic metabolism is also known as glycolysis, and aerobic metabolism includes complicated cycles such as the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. Aerobic metabolism is the primary energy source of resting muscles. The cell breaks down fatty acids, and through aerobic metabolism, it's able to produce about 34 ATP molecules per glucose. And this occurs in the mitochondria. Anaerobic glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. And it's the primary energy source during peak muscular activity. The output of anaerobic glycolysis is the production of 2 ATP molecules per glucose. So it is not as efficient as aerobic metabolism, but it gives your body a way of generating ATP in the absence of oxygen. Muscle metabolism. At rest, skeletal muscles metabolize fatty acids, and they tend to store the sugars, as well as they generate creatine phosphate. During moderate activity, muscles generate ATP through aerobic metabolism of glucose primarily. So you get 34 molecules of ATP per glucose molecule. During peak activity, the cell has to rely on anaerobic glycolysis, which generates only 2 ATP molecules per glucose, and you get a byproduct. So you get 2 ATP plus pyruvate. And pyruvate is then converted into lactate or lactic acid. Lactic acid is the burn that you feel after a really good workout. And that burn, while we may associate it with positive feelings, i.e., we did really well, it's actually pain caused by changes in the acidity of the tissue. You actually, through the creation of lactic acid, you're going to lower the pH of that tissue, and it's actually going to start damaging some of the components of the cell, and that's going to trigger pain receptors. So the production of lactate, i.e. lactic acid, is not always a positive thing, but in the absence of oxygen, it's the only way our cell can produce ATP, so it is required. These diagrams sort of outline the metabolism of skeletal muscle fibers at those 3 stages. Here we have rest. So the demand for ATP is low. There's sufficient oxygen available for the mitochondria to undergo aerobic metabolism. Fatty acids are absorbed and broken down in the mitochondria, creating a surplus of ATP. Some mitochondrial ATP is used to convert any glucose that is present into glycogen. Remember, glycogen is the polysaccharide. It's the way glucose is stored in the body. Mitochondrial ATP is used to convert creatinine to creatinine phosphate, so you get a little bit of backup storage energy, and it's going to result in a buildup of energy reserves, both in the form of glycogen and CP in the muscle. So that is at rest. When we look at moderate activity, the demand for ATP is going to increase because the muscle is working at a moderate level. There's still enough oxygen for the mitochondria to meet the demand, so you don't have to worry about the cell moving into an anaerobic metabolic state. The oxygen is delivered by the cardiovascular system from the lungs. So if you think about it, as you start some moderate activity, let's say you start jogging on a treadmill, your respiratory rate is going to go up, and that is so that the cardiovascular system can deliver enough oxygen to our cells in order for the cells to maintain a state of aerobic metabolism. As long as that moderate activity doesn't exceed the amount of oxygen you can bring in, you'll stay aerobic. ATP is generated, as we already said, primarily through aerobic metabolism, and we get some of the glucose stored as glycogen. If the glycogen reserves are low, the muscle fiber can also break down other substrates such as fatty acids that we saw with the previous. So all the ATP generated is used to power that muscle contraction. And in fact, if you look at numbers, we end up generating a quite hefty supply of ATP. And then we move to peak activity. At this point, the cell is requiring a tremendous amount of ATP, and oxygen cannot diffuse into the skeletal muscle fiber fast enough for the mitochondria to maintain aerobic metabolism. Only 1/3 of the cell's ATP needs can be met by the mitochondria. So the cell is going to switch to anaerobic metabolism or glycolysis. Okay, and remember, glycolysis generates about 2 molecules of ATP per glucose, but you also get the production of pyruvate, which is quickly converted into lactic acid, and we see that right here. And lactic acid is going to directly affect the pH of the surrounding tissues, as well as the potential of that lactic acid getting into the blood supply and affecting other areas as well. The recovery period is the time required after exertion for muscles to return to normal. If you think about what normal looks like, well, we have to reestablish an oxygen supply. We then can shift to aerobic metabolism. We can build up the amount of ATP we have stored. We can replenish the creatinine phosphate molecules. We can then store our glucose in the form of glycogen. Also, during the recovery period, we have to get rid of that lactate, or the lactic acid that was produced, and we do that through a biochemical pathway called the Cori cycle. Lactate is transferred from the muscles to the liver, and the liver is going to convert lactate back to pyruvate. And the pyruvate, for the most part, can be converted to glucose and then reused to build glycogen reserves in the muscles, or just be available for aerobic metabolism when the time comes. So the Cori cycle is how the body gets rid of lactic acid. It's done in the liver, and basically it's converted back to pyruvate, which is a usable molecule. The oxygen debt, this is also known as the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. After we're done, after the period of exertion, the body needs more oxygen than usual in order to normalize the metabolic activities of the mitochondria. So our breathing rate and the depth that we take our breaths are increased in order to bring in adequate amounts of oxygen, and that's going to continue until the oxygen debt is paid. In terms of heat production, skeletal muscles produce a tremendous amount of heat. In fact, they release up to 85% of the heat that is needed to maintain normal body temperature. This is why shivering is one mechanism associated with thermal regulation. We can quickly increase our core body temperature just through muscle activity, because so much of that energy is lost as heat. In summary, skeletal muscles at rest metabolize fatty acids and store glycogen. During light activities, muscles generate ATP through aerobic metabolic breakdown of carbs, lipids, or amino acids. And during peak activity, energy is provided by anaerobic reactions within the cytoplasm that generates lactic acid as a byproduct. There are several hormones that are required for proper muscle metabolism. These include growth hormone, testosterone, thyroid hormones, and epinephrine. And we cover these in great detail in AMP2, so I'm not going to spend time now discussing them, but do know that they are required for normal metabolic activities for skeletal muscles. Just some terms to learn associated with performance. Force is the maximum amount of tension produced. Endurance is the amount of time an activity could be sustained. And both force and endurance depend on two things. One, how physically fit a person is, but secondarily, the types of muscle fibers that dominate in an individual's muscle.